Share screen. All right. We want to thank y'all for joining us for the 2021 Virtual Southern Home and Garden Show virtual presentation. Today we have Mr. Kevin Rose talking to us about basic vegetable gardening. We would like to thank our sponsors, the Pulaski Lions Club, Bankston Motor Homes, Big Creek Winery, Blue Line Pressure Washing Services, Bull on the Run, Farm Bureau, Five Stone Landscaping, Giles County Co-op, Haney Realty and Property Management, Pulaski Electric Company, Pilot Maintenance, Tri-Green Equipment, the Giles County Chamber, and UTTSU Extension Giles County. We also ask that you be sure to check out our vendors. All American Gutter Protection, Aspen Hill Growers, Butcher Drafting, Columbia Kubota, Flowers Creamery, Georgia's Quilts, Guardian Garage Floors, Kathy G Creations, Lane Roofing, and Leaf Guard. And with that, I'm going to turn our presentation over to Mr. Kevin Rose.
Okay, are you seeing my basic vegetable gardening screen there?
Not yet, Kevin.
And now, how about now?
Yes, and it is good.
All right, so we'll just jump in here, basic vegetable gardening, and we'll jump into the first side, which basically, when you start thinking about a garden, there's many ways to put a garden together. I started helping my dad when I was a child, planting tomatoes and beans and digging potatoes. Brings back a lot of memories. I think folks used to, that was a natural thing. We just had a garden, and maybe we've gotten away from it over the years. I haven't. I've had a garden for as many years as I can remember, and I think it's nice to be able to grow fresh produce and go out and pick something and bring it in and enjoy it there. It's fresh, fresh grown, certainly healthy and all of that. So I think there's a few questions to answer. We start getting into our garden. The first one will naturally be, which vegetables do I like? And this is what our presentation is going to focus on. How do I set up my gardening? What gardening tools are needed? How do I improve my soil? What are the issues that we might see through the garden season? And when do I know it's ready? So when we start talking about which vegetables, there's basically cool season vegetables and there's warm season vegetables. And, sometimes we'll plant, like right now, I'm fixing to plant onions. I hope I can go home this afternoon, weather permitting, and get some onions in the ground, maybe a little late. I like green onions. I'm not looking to grow a big bulb, but naturally these would be something you would grow in a cooler season. Cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, radishes, all of those are things that we can grow late in the fall, sometimes very early spring or late winter. Typically, when we think about a garden, we're probably thinking more of warm season vegetables, tomatoes, green beans, sweet corn, okra, squash, peppers. There's a variety of things that we can put in our garden. Herbs are not listed here, but that's certainly another thing. So as we move forward, once we make those decisions, what we like, what we want to put in the garden, the types of things we want to use, we certainly need to think about a setup. And traditionally, I think if you look at that middle picture at the top, we have a big garden area, lots of rows of stuff. That's kind of traditionally what we always had and maybe still continue to grow. But I think over the last few years, we've seen things change, people gardening in small spaces. We talk about container gardens, the lower left picture there, just somebody got some very small containers. They're an easy way to garden. You don't have to have a big tiller and work up a lot of half-acre ground or whatever. So I think that's an advantage. Easy to water, take care of. Probably not as strenuous work maybe, you know, to walk up to a little spot like that and plant and easy to weed, lots of things there for advantages. And, you know, as I looked around and saw the different images that are out there for vegetable gardens, that one in the middle, lower middle there, somebody's kind of set that up, designed that as maybe a space to just go out and relax in, but yet the garden's there, entertain folks. So there's a lot of ways that we can set up our garden. Raised beds, again, is certainly very popular, and there's a variety of ways, and you can just search raised bed garden if you want to get some ideas. There's all kinds of ideas out there, growing in tires or around different unique spaces, all that kind of stuff. So we don't have to have a lot of area to garden. We can find ways to garden. Of course, myself, I'm sort of the traditional garden. I've got a pretty good size area, and that's what I use. But certainly there are different ways that we can set up a garden and have a nice garden, even in a small space. So as we're thinking about setting these gardens up, we certainly need a plan. I run mine by rows, kind of like what the lower right-hand image is here, but there's a variety of ways to do it. You can garden in areas. Again, it may depend on whether you're putting in a raised bed area or a large area. Then there's those specialty gardens. The one in the middle there might be considered a pizza garden, shaped like a pizza. We grow items, tomatoes and peppers and some of the herbs and things that we might use on a pizza. That's kind of a neat way to get kids involved in gardening. So we can look at certainly different ways that we lay out our plan. One of the things that's very important when we're laying out a garden, and we're going to be in that same area year after year, is crop rotation. And I always grow corn in one area of the garden and tomatoes in the other, and then I basically flip-flop them every year because we want to break up any disease problems that we might have, and we're putting a legume plant like a tomato, say, behind a grass plant like corn or sweet corn, and that will help us to reduce some of the issues that we have sometimes with insects and diseases. So I like to do that rotation in mine every year. So one end of my garden is always going to be corn, several rows of that. The other end is going to be a couple of rows of tomatoes, and then I'm going to swap those out each year. So as you're putting that plan together, those are all things that you really need to think about. And then, of course, there are tools out there. Sometimes there's specific things that we need. Sometimes maybe we don't need necessarily a wheelbarrow load of tools, but it may depend on what what kind of garden we have. If we're going to have a half-acre garden, we're probably going to need a tiller, certainly a shovel, rake, and a hoe. The hoe is probably going to be the most used tool in there for weeding purposes. Shovel for planting. I use a shovel and a hoe most of the season, it seems, when you're in gardening, especially the hoe for weeding. I run a tiller. That's a great way to keep weeds out and to bust up the soil a little bit. But you don't necessarily need all those tools if you got a raised garden. This little shot on the right where you got a little wall there with some small tools hanging there, that may be all that's needed. So sometimes you got to decide maybe what you need based on how large an area or what type of garden that you're going to, put in. So the next question would be, how do I improve my soil? Well, with UT Extension, we would certainly recommend the soil test. And I have soil tests in my garden, and I base a lot of my recommendations, or base my fertilizing on the recommendations that's been given. You might say, well, how do we do that? Well, I wanted to outline the steps here. Basically, we're going to pull random samples within the garden area. This could be a small 4-foot by 4-foot container garden. If you have brought soil in and built it up and put it in a little area, you probably need to sample that soil. You wouldn't be taking, say, 10 to 15 samples or probes. You might take 3 or 4 but you certainly want it to represent that area. And that's why we say we want to pull about 10 to 15 samples for this test around the area, because we need it to represent the whole area. We also know that roots will use nutrients down to about 6 inches deep in most cases. So we need to make sure that we are basing our sample or our test on soil that's been sampled 6 inches deep. So after we go around the field, and of course, you can get the big expensive probes. You can use a spade, anything that you can go 6 inches deep, pull a 6-inch sample out. I usually take a 5-gallon bucket, mix it in that bucket, and you're actually going to pull about a cup of that out to send to the lab. It doesn't take a lot of soil, but again, you want that soil test to represent the entire garden area or garden space. And again, it could be a half-acre garden, or it could be a 4x4 raised bed, but I think it is important that we sample those. If I had a series of raised beds and I had put soil in there in each one, I would probably sample each of those separate. Now the cost is $15 to do that, but I think that would be an advantage. I wouldn't want to mix all those together, especially if soil came from different areas. So I think it is important that we individually sample those raised beds, unless all your soil came basically from one place. So we actually say don't guess soil test. I mean, we get calls in extension from time to time, people asking about fertilizer and what they should use and this and that. But our answer is always we need a soil test. We need to know, because I can't really look at your soil and tell you what to expect. I mean, we have some idea of some of these crops and what the pH needs to be and what type of fertilizer they may need. But the best way to do it is with the soil test. And again, then we want to fertilize based on the results. And I just threw up a lot of examples because there are different types of fertilizer. We've got the bagged, traditional bags of fertilizer where it might be a 10-10 or a 15-15. Sometimes you can buy small bags of different kind of fertilizer. You've got the Miracle-Gro, and Miracle-Gro works good. Sometimes, though, I've seen examples where we've used too much Miracle-Gro. We've had folks come in and say they've had a tomato plant as tall as their house and wanting to know why. A lot of times after a series of questions, we find out that they're hitting it with Miracle-Gro quite a bit more than it needs. Well, that plant just keeps growing because they're putting a lot of nitrogen on. And sometimes that'll keep your fruit from setting, knock your blooms off. So basically, we want to make sure that we're providing adequate fertilizer, but not too much. Of course, compost is good. It's always good to have some of those compost and organic sources are fine to work into the soil. The more you can work organic matter in the soil, the better nutrients you're going to have there available for your plants. And then the picture in the lower middle is actually pelletized lime. And pelletized lime is a great fit for a homeowner or gardener who's gardening in a small space, because a lot of times if we look at, say, a field, a lot of times the lime recommendations are for, maybe a ton or ton and a half, 2 tons to an acre. So you can imagine that's a lot of fertilizer. Well, a lot of lime spread, and it's usually in a powdered form, but they created this pelletized lime so that we can get it in by the bag. And if we need to raise a small garden area from lime based on our recommendation, we can have that. I mean, we can go and get a few 100 pounds, and it's easy to spread and handle and so forth. So a soil test will tell us everything we need to know. The basic things are on this slide. And I will say this: if we have a low pH and we don't know that we do, and we go out and we continue to fertilize with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which is what's in a 10-10 bag, for example, a lot of those nutrients are not really not available to the plant because their pH is so low. They get tied up with some other nutrients there, and they're just not available. So pH is very important in soil and growing plants. We have to get that pH right. Most of our plants are going to grow between about 6 and 6.5, 6.5 roughly. Sometimes tomato, there's a few acid-loving crops like blueberries, some other things that will grow at a little bit lower pH in the upper 5s, let's say. But for the most part, most of our plants are going to grow best at 6 to 6.5. And if we've got a very low pH and we keep putting fertilizer out, we're throwing fertilizer that's really not being effective. So pH is very critical, and more so sometimes than folks think. So again, a soil test will tell us what our pH is, and a recommendation will be made for how much lime is needed, and then we can convert this pelletized lime into what we need in a small garden area. And another thing that we can do from two standpoints, this is actually a shot of my garden last year. This picture was actually taken on about April the 4th or 5th, so it's almost been a year. That is the crimson clover. And I've tried to sow cover crops on it the last few years. It don't look near that good this year for whatever reason. I didn't get as good a stand of crimson clover. But one end of it looks about like this, at least, and that's where my tomatoes are going. And something I'm thinking about doing this year, rather than just burning this down or turning it under, is the last few years on my tomatoes, I've gotten where I've just grown them in mulch. And I've really used straw, and I've burned down with Roundup or something, gone out there and killed the grass, and just gone back in and planted the tomatoes and let that grass just, well, I'm saying the grass, the crimson clover just lay out there on top of the ground. But I've been adding straw to it. And this year I'm going to try to go in and basically just go into that green mulch and plant some tomatoes and see how good my weed control will be. And I know as this clover begins to bloom, it's going to start fixing more and more nitrogen. And so that's another thing that's going to be good. So I'm kind of playing with that. But I think the cover crop, you can see, if I didn't have that cover crop up there, I'd be covered up in purple mint and dead nettle and some of those type of things. You can actually see that, if I can see right in there is some of that dead nettle. And, you know, it will take over in the wintertime. And so you could, you know, by putting out the clover, I'm trying to reduce having, you know, those weeds, but I'm also trying to add something in there to help the plants. And certainly the cover crop will. On the half of the garden, I'm going to plant corn and some other things. I'm going to turn that under, probably just turn it under green and let it provide the organic matter and so forth that it will. So a cover crop can be really helpful. And you can actually put a cover crop in a raised bed. I mean, it wouldn't take much to get it started. Anything to protect that soil or to continue to add organic matter to it will help it and improve it over time. So the next question we got here, what issues might we have? There could be a variety of things. Basically, we're talking water, insects, disease, and weeds. The insects is probably going to be the biggest problem, and diseases with certain plants. The cucurbits especially will have a lot of disease issues from time to time, and sometimes they're spread by insects. So it is important to keep an eye on that. I know growing up, my dad, you know, the common product to use was Sevin, and he would mix it in the sprayer and go out and spray the garden, and we stayed out of it. And you know, he just sprayed. That was a routine thing that he did. And I think a lot of folks do. Well, now I don't know that that's just something we do as much of. We try not to spray if there's no need in it. I try not to spray at all. If you grow potatoes, Irish potatoes, I've had a tremendous problem. Colorado potato beetle, and I finally had to give in and spray that, and cabbage. So that's why I don't grow those any longer, because the insects just take them over. I have a hard time with cabbage, and you're out there spraying, and you know, it just I don't like to do that and go in and try to eat that vegetable that's been sprayed heavily, just try to keep the bugs off of it. So that is basically my philosophy. Every now and then, if I do have a problem, I will treat it, but I try not to spray when we can. There's certainly on watering. We'll talk about that real quick. There is needs from time to time for water. We don't always get the water, the rain. Sometimes it doesn't hit in a timely way. So if you've got access to water, that's a good thing to keep things growing and looking good. Basically, there's several options. I like to use a soaker hose, which is in the lower right-hand corner. A couple of advantages I think there is the water moisture just kind of seeps out of that hose and goes straight into the ground. So it's immediately available, and you can lay those hoses right at the roots of your plant. The other thing is when the picture above with the spray going out, if we're doing a lot of that, especially late in the evening, we're wetting those leaf surfaces, which can create an environment for diseases. So if we're going to water with that type of water, we're taking a hose and we're going out with a sprayer on the hose, and we're going to spray it down. That watering probably needs to be done more earlier in the day, so that we can allow the leaves to dry out to try to reduce diseases. If we're watering late in the afternoon, if we're doing a soaker hose, it's okay because we're not getting much on the leaves. But if we're spraying water out over the whole garden, then that could become an issue. Drip irrigation is another thing. I know Darby's done that in her garden, and I'm going to do that this year with some of our fruits that we have, is using drip irrigation. And you can see that picture on the left where the water just basically goes right where you want it to go. And advantage to doing that type of watering is you're not watering in between the rows, which is where the weeds are going to grow, so you can kind of starve them. If you've got if you're watering wide open like the upper right hand picture, you're watering all areas of the soil. And so that's an opportunity for weed growth. So I think when you're using the soaker hose and the drip irrigation, some of these other types of systems that are out there, you're going to reduce, hopefully, some of the weed pressure that you would have. Again, we're talking about protecting vegetables from certainly from insects and diseases. And we kind of talked on that already a little bit, but we've got a couple pretty good publications that are on controlling garden insects, publication 595, and there's also one on disease control in the home garden. I don't really spray a lot of fungicides for diseases. Most of the time, that's not an issue. Again, sometimes tomatoes, there's issues with tomatoes. Sometimes we do have insects. We've just got to go out and get them. I've had issues in the past on peppers with blister beetles, and they'll just seem to cover them up. Well, if you don't do something about it, the insects are they're going to get it all. So I don't think it would encourage you not to just be spraying the entire garden to protect, but to kind of treat areas that maybe have an outbreak or a certain variety or plant, and focus on those and leave the rest alone. Certainly would encourage you to think that way. Now, always there's organic options. Sometimes they may not be 100% control, but they will help. But there are BT products available, insecticidal soaps, which are good on aphids more than anything, horticultural oil. There's neem oil, diatomaceous earth. Certainly those are all options from an organic standpoint. I don't really use any of those. I like, but they are there. They're available for those folks that are more on the thinking organically and wanting to produce organically. And another thing that I do try to take advantage of is the beneficial insects. A lot of times if you go to the garden, you see a lot of bugs out there, but not all of them are are harmful. For example, the old tobacco tomato worm there in the middle, if you see one with all those white cocoons on him, leave him alone, because that is a parasitic wasp that has laid those eggs, and every one of those cocoons will produce another wasp. And so you certainly wouldn't want to get rid of that bug, or that tomato worm there, because we're going to have some more predators down the road for them. If you see those those particular worms on tomatoes and you don't have the cocoons on them, just pick them off and destroy them that way. Lady beetles are really good. I know we fuss about them in our homes in the fall and over winter, but usually if lady beetles are in our garden, they're probably following the food source, which is probably aphids, and aphids can be cause some of the most damage on a lot of our garden vegetables. So those are beneficial. The picture in the upper right hand is an immature lady beetle. So and you can see that green aphids there in that picture. That is actually feeding on green aphids. Well, if you come in there and spray that with an insecticide, you're going to kill the lady beetle larva along with everything else. So again, let some of these beneficials help you. The green lace bug in the upper left and the assassin bug in the lower left are a couple of others that feed on other insects. So sometimes we can, our natural beneficial insects can kind of help us with some control as well. Some organic disease practices, just a list of some things that you can do. Of course, one is to plant early in the spring as practical. We're right at the point right now where, like I said, I hope to get out this afternoon. We're at a point here in early April. It's time to garden. The weather's gotten right. And so we want to get out there and get things in and try to get in front of some of these potential issues. We plant well drained soil, or again, a raised vegetable garden bed's a little easier to keep up than we said a half-acre garden. We certainly try to keep the weeds out. Weeds will harbor diseases and sometimes insects. We've already mentioned watering in the morning, not at night, because of the disease issues. We've talked about, and showed you a few of the options that can be effective for some diseases, and neem oil is just one of the examples there. There's resistant varieties. And when you're picking out seeds or you're picking out plants, those are some things to look for. There are some tomato plants out there now that are resistant to several of the tomato diseases. So that's something to certainly consider. And another thing, now folks are going to begin to go to the garden centers and other places to pick up plants. Make sure that you're looking through those plants, that you're not getting diseased plants or plants that, the leaves are got a brown spot on them or something don't look right with the stem. A lot of times we're just going through and we say, well, there's a variety of tomato that we want. We just start grabbing one. It really pays to go through there and look at those plants closely and make sure that there's no brown spots, which could be a disease that you might move to your garden. So that's important. And I talked a little bit earlier about crop rotation. I think certainly that helps when we can rotate, especially our grass plants like corn versus legume plants like tomatoes. And again, disease control really starts with healthy plants. Weeds are a problem. We've kind of hit on those a little bit. They can steal nutrients, and certainly they can steal moisture. They can take over a garden. So there are a few things that you can do. I've talked about that. That's not my garden, the lower left where those tomatoes are, but that's kind of what mine looks like when I put straw down. I cover everything. The other thing about the straw is I've noticed is it really holds moisture in. If you're out watering or you have a rain and you come back and rake that straw, it really holds moisture. And I think that's something that can really be a help, but it certainly keeps down the weeds as well. But there's some other things. There's some fabric you can get newspapers, there's leaves, compost, the landscape fabric, all that kind of stuff can work. I've primarily used straw and been very well pleased with it. And really, the last question is, and maybe the most important one, I know it's ready. We have an extension publication there that can go on the Hort link, and I know that may have already been shared in some of these sessions, but there's a vegetable garden resource area there. It's got all these publications there, and it talks a little bit about when to harvest and how to take care of it after harvest and that sort of thing. But if you look up the picture to the left there, the zucchini, once zucchini, it'll keep getting bigger and bigger. It'll never seem to stop. You'll have one as big as your arm out there before you know it. So it grows fast. And of course, sometimes the larger vegetables get, in most cases, they're not as good. They're a lot better if we can get them selected when they're ready. So that's kind of a key thing is really, if you've got a garden, especially a large garden, but even with a container garden, you need to be out there in it every day, seeing what's going on. Even if you're certain there's nothing to pick, it's always good to just walk through, check on things, make sure that your pepper plants are not covered up with some bug or something strange has jumped on the tomatoes all of a sudden, those kinds of things. Because sometimes if we can find some of that stuff early enough, we might can control it with something or pull a plant that we need to get out of there and it won't affect the rest of them. So it is good to get out and walk through your garden and take a look at these things. But when things are getting ripe, that's when they need to be picked, because stuff can over ripen. And when you get over ripened tomatoes and things on the vine, that attracts more insects and creates more issues. So, and there's a certain time that some of these vegetables are going to be, ready. Some are going to start producing right off, and others it's going to take the season, say like carrots. It's going to be a while before you're ready to harvest a carrot. Where you plant a squash, you're going to have squash coming in, almost daily once they start coming in. So there's a difference in some of these vegetables. So, being out there scouting, keep an eye on things, that's how we know, hey, when it's ready. And there's information in addition to what we've got. There's information out there on when things are ready and what you need to look for and so forth. A couple of these resources, I already mentioned the Hort website, the second reference there. And then the first one is the Tennessee Home Fruit and Vegetable Garden Calendar, which is a good resource. But if you go to the Hort website, the calendar's on there, the publications that I've already mentioned, there's a variety of resources there, a lot of good information. I would say that if you're researching information on the internet, we encourage you to look at some of the university-based information, because we realize this is research-based information, and it's very reliable. And there's naturally a lot of UT sources, but there's other universities who put out some good information. And so anytime you're doing a search, we'd encourage you to look toward those university sites, and those usually end in .edu or something like that you can review and find that information. It's usually reliable, very reliable information. And that's all we've got. Darby, I'm going to stop sharing. There may be some questions that we need to answer, and we can do that.
I've posted a couple of those links into the chat now that you were talking about, Kevin. Well, hold on.
Yeah, I see there's a comment there about the bird net over brassicas. Yeah, I mean, sometimes you have to some things you have to just resort to. I mean, there's some things that are very susceptible to birds and other predators, and you got to protect them as best you can. I'll tell you that my dad, the job I had when we set tomatoes, especially early tomatoes, there's always cutworms out there. Usually when the weather warms, we don't see them as well. But if you've got your garden next to an area where there's, grass is grown up, you don't mow, and it's next to a field or whatever, a lot of times there's cutworms there, and they can move into the garden. And something we used to do was, and I still do today, go get some twigs and break them, little pieces 2-3 inches long, put one on either side of the tomato plant or any kind of individual plant you put out like that, just to keep cutworms from wrapping around. They can't wrap around it to cut it off. So that's a little practice I've done for years. Now, again, we're getting a little warmer, and cutworms won't be as much of a problem going forward, but it seems like they always find garden plants. So there's little things like that that you can do to kind of keep down some of those issues as well.
Hey, Kevin, I'm going to ask this because I have them quite often in my garden. But fire ants in the garden, are there very many things that are labeled for that?
Yes, there are a few things on the bait side of things. I want to tell you the right one. I think Extinguish is the one. Extinguish is the bait product that is labeled in the gardens. And then some of the insecticides that's labeled for gardens are also labeled for fire ants. So that's an option. But I know on the bait side of things, Extinguish is labeled, and we make those bait recommendations quite often. But that's one that you could use there, or any insecticide that's labeled in a garden, and it will tell on the label whether it controls fire ants or not. But there's a few, if anybody's got questions on that one specific, they can call us, because right off the top of my head, I can't remember all those products that are available.
Okay.
And I appreciate the idea too there about the bird netting over the cabbage. So the cabbage moth is a problem. It's like if you got cabbage, you got cabbage moth. If you got potatoes, you got the Colorado potato beetle. A lot of times I get Colorado potato beetles even on the tomatoes, and that's a real problem. But some insects are just going to find. It amazes me because with the potato beetle, I didn't grow potatoes for a while. The first year I put them in, I don't know where they came from, but boy, they just appeared. So,
and Ann has put a question in the chat, Kevin, if you want to answer
soil
it.
Test, you can go to the UT Soil Test Lab and download the forms. We have the boxes at the office. What we usually recommend with folks is to get the forms, and they can pick the boxes up with us, put them in your soil, take it to the post office, and you can send all that into one package. So that's how the best way to do the soil test, because they have to, soil will weigh different amounts, and that leads to different postage. And so a lot of times we just encourage folks to get the materials once they gather their soil test, just run it to the post office and see what the best way to ship that, basically, that they have.
And Kevin, you was talking on the soil testing, but some people, if they're doing the raised beds, they bring in like the potting media, and that's different if you're testing it versus the soil test.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a test for testing that media, and that is on the UT Soil and Pest Lab. You can just do a Google search for that, and you can test the different medias as well as your soil. And on the fertilizing, a lot of times, liming, you'd lime the whole field, or you could work, like if it recommends sometimes they'll recommend so many pounds of a triple 10 or a 6, 12, 12 or whatever it is, and you can just put that in the whole garden. Sometimes I will treat with Miracle-Gro individual plants, or I'll fertilize right at the base of those plants. I do think that makes a difference. Fertilizer helps things grow, and as long as your pH is right, it can use those nutrients. And I think you'll find that if you're placing that fertilizer at the base of those plants where those roots can get it, it does make a difference.
Okay, you just had another one posted.
Yeah, I see. Jimson is I guess that's really a type of a lime source in a way. I've never used it on my garden. Darby, have you ever used Jimson?
When I worked at the co-op, one of the things that they told us, or that we told people, was they could actually put Jimson into like clay soils, and it actually helps to kind of break it up, to aerate it some. You know, it gives some of the some space in it. So, you know, like if you had a really tight clay soil, you could add Jimson to it, and it just helps to make it a little better soil for you to plant in.
Yeah, and I've done that with peat moss as well, where I had a real heavy clay area around the house. You were trying to plant flowers or whatever in it. I've actually add a lot of peat moss. That kind of helps, because clay doesn't have a lot of organic matter, and we'd like to see, you know, the more we've got in the soil, the better our plants are going to do.
Any other questions? You can feel free to unmute and ask them if you want to unmute instead of typing it in the chat, or you can type it in the chat there.
Well, Darby, if that's all the questions, I would just say that we're available, and I'll give Darby credit. She probably handles more of our hort stuff, and maybe even does a better job than me in answering a lot of those questions. But if you've got questions about your garden, you know, give us a call. We'll be glad to talk with you, answer questions. Or maybe if you get into the season and you get a disease on a tomato, something you're not sure of, you want to check that out. That's why we're here. We can come out and make a visit. You can bring us a sample in, send us a picture by email or whatever. We'll be glad to assist you any way we can during the garden season.
All right, looks like we don't have any other questions coming in, Kevin. So with that, I guess we are going to end our presentation today. Thanks everybody for visiting with us today.
Darby, before you close out,